So what I'm going to do very quickly today, because I want to leave a lot of time for answering your questions, is to do two things. I'm going to tell you a history of the past, which is drawn from my book, The Chinese Must Go, and that focuses on a particular moment in the history of anti-Asian violence. And when I say a history of the past, what I mean is history for its own sake, on its own terms. Some things will resonate with today's situation, but history doesn't form a straight line to the present, so it should not be used in sort of an allegorical way. This is not the present. But in part two, what I'm going to do is try to offer more of a history of the present. That is, look at the moment that we are in now and think about what possible antecedents we could see, what sort of knowledge we need to have to be able to interpret what we're seeing at this moment. And then to open up conversations about how we can go forward. And this is meant as more broad and suggestive. It's getting me out of my my favorite time period, which is the 19th century. So first, we're going to start in the past. So in my own work, I study anti-Chinese violence in the 19th century. And this violence dates all the way back to the 1850s, the moment in which Chinese migrants started coming in large numbers to the United States as part of the gold rush. Violence at this time took various forms, things as simple as rock throwing in the streets of San Francisco, or lynchings in gold mines. So it's sort of a wide range. What I study in particular is an unprecedented outbreak of anti-Chinese violence that followed several decades later, in 1885 and 1886. So in this a little bit over a period of a year, more than 168 communities attempted to expel their Chinese neighbors from these Western states and territories. And we can see, if we line this up with sort of the Chinese population at the time, that these expulsions basically just follow where the Chinese were at this time in the US. And at times, these expulsions and this form of racial violence was sort of racial violence in its most basic and brazen form. So that is physical force motivated by racial prejudice and intended to cause bodily harm. The vigilantes targeted all Chinese people, young and old, male and female, rich and poor. And they did things like plant bombs beneath businesses, shoot blindly through cloth tents, set homes ablaze. And then once physical force, physical threat really became a real and tangible threat at the time, vigilantes who hoped to expel Chinese from their communities turned to more subtle forces, things like coercion, harassment, and intimidation. They did things like post a deadline for the Chinese to leave town and then leave unspoken what the consequences would be for non-compliance. And we have various sort of visual representations of this violence. One of the best known is this Harper's Weekly illustration of the most deadly to date in 1885 and best known riot, which is in Rock Springs, Wyoming territory, where at least 28 Chinese were killed, and then 15 more were wounded, and then hundreds were sort of driven out of Rock Springs, Wyoming. We have very few photographs that show this violence. This is a rare one, a photograph of the burning of Old Market Street, Chinatown in San Jose. And what we see in the foreground is sort of white American spectators of the burning of Chinatown. In my book, I spent a lot of time thinking about Tacoma, Washington territory, where the Chinese were warned to leave a month in advance. They were given a deadline by November 1st, 1885. And then the Chinese that had not left by that deadline were forcibly driven out. And here in the text, it says, these few shacks in the foreground were burned in 1885. So it sort of tells you what happened next. It was a moment on November 3rd, 1885, the Chinese were rounded up and marched down the street of Tacoma and then forced marched out of Tacoma 8 miles to a railroad depot. This all occurred in the driving rain, and 2 Chinese died of exposure during this forced march. For this, we don't have an image of the expulsion itself. Instead, we have this, which is a commemorative photograph of the vigilantes who posed afterwards. We see illustrations or photographs like this. There's some things we can learn. I mean, in this one, I think you can understand that people were proud of their actions in the expulsion of the Chinese based on the photograph. And we can also look at who was involved. Here we have pictured the mayor of Tacoma, the sheriff, the probate judge, the fire chief, the woman and child is the wife of a journalist from the town who could not be in the photo. He was out of town on assignment, so she stood in for him. You know, this gives us a sense of that this violence in some ways, although not explicitly state violence, not explicitly coming from state officials, many public officials were involved in these expulsion attempts and involved in a very public manner. Most of these expulsions were not intended to be lethal, but there are exceptions. We do see some lynchings. And I'm going to show you one photograph, which is grotesque and it's upsetting, and you don't have to look at it if you don't want to. But I'm going to show it to you. It's an image of a lynching of a Chinese man, and I'm going to tell you why I'm showing it as I show it now. This is an image of the lynching of Hong Di, who was lynched in Colusa, California. And I show this, I have it in my book, and I show it in presentations because I think that we don't have a cultural memory of anti-Chinese violence. We don't have sort of, as a society, we don't have a preconception of what this violence looks like in the way that we have an image of perhaps Black lynching, which is an image so grotesque, but also ubiquitous, that I think that showing images of that sort can be sometimes gratuitous. I think in comparison for anti-Asian violence, I think that we don't know what this looks like. We do need to look at it and try to remember. And I think that this image captures the severity. I also think that this image captures his humanity. This is a 17-year-old adolescent. And it gives us a sense of a person that sort of, when I show numbers and dots on a map, I cannot capture. And the final reason I show it is because it was meant to be viewed, right? This is not a private photograph. It's in fact a postcard. It can be read as an artifact and a sense of like the dissemination of images of anti-Asian violence. Historians have often claimed that racial violence are fundamental to making the United States, but I think that usually they're talking about things like the violence of colonization, of enslavement, of segregation. And within this, anti-Chinese violence or larger anti-Asian violence is routinely left out of the national narrative. And I think that there's many reasons for this. One of them is just about numbers. There were a lot fewer Chinese in 19th century America than these other groups, and fewer of them lost their lives to racial violence. And so when we look at numbers, in some ways, it can seem less consequential. So the 1880 census recorded 105,000 Chinese in the United States. At least 85 men perished during this peak moment of violence in the mid-1880s. But I also think that the omission of this history can be explained by the violence itself. The Chinese migration began in the 1850s, as I said, when thousands of Chinese joined the rush for gold into California. But while other newcomers to America claimed a place in American society and American memory, I think that the violence itself helped to push Chinese to the recesses of the nation and the national memory. And I take as an example Tacoma. So Tacoma, after this expulsion, there were no Chinese left in Tacoma. And then thanks to arsonists, there wasn't even physical remnants of what once had been. And in fact, In Tacoma, there's been a present day effort at what they call reconciliation. It's been going on since the 1990s. And so they've spent decades searching for the descendants of the Tacoma Chinese, but they have yet to find any. And I think that that gives us a sense of how successful some of these expulsions were and how they could erase entire communities and also memories. So rather than focus on the causes of this violence, since I'm sort of aiming to hit the present, I'm going to talk more about its effects. On the local level, anti-Chinese violence, I argue in my book, helped to define racial boundaries. So drawing lines of division across the geography and community and economy of the American West. And one of the most vivid examples, I think, of this is the ways in which the communities were literally remapped. And to do this, I look at Sanborn fire insurance maps, which perhaps you've seen a Sanborn fire insurance map before. The Sanborn Fire Insurance Company went across the United States in the 19th and 20th century, mapping towns and cities. Mostly they're trying to insure people against fire, so it maps things like, is this a wood building or a brick building? With the exception of the Chinese. So the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company, probably based on racial stereotypes, also indicates whether a building is occupied by Chinese people. And so this allows me to look at the ways in which the towns were remapped by this violence. So here's an example from Eureka, California, in which the block of Chinatown is just labeled vacant in the year after a very successful expulsion from Eureka. We can also use these fire insurance maps to make modern maps like this, where we can see that some of these expulsions didn't drive the Chinese entirely out of cities, it just drove them to the outskirts. So here's an example from Riverside, California, where we see that old Chinatown was sort of in this square mile of the city center in Riverside, and it is moved to the outskirts as a result of this violence. There's other ways that we can think about this and see the long-term effects. Here is a list of the buildings burned in Tacoma, Washington Territory in 1885. It was written in an attempt to ask for redress. And I'll note that it's two-sided. So there's more buildings burned than just the ones you see here. And when I see a source like this, what I see is not just a destruction of property and the sort of expulsion of individual merchants, but it's actually really a loss of many other things. Because the merchants in these towns, the people that would have owned property, often acted as the banks for even the working class. So they were holding the money and helping to facilitate the working class community as well. So I see loss not just for the merchants with property, but also the workers who are working with them, and then the families all the way back in China that felt the effects, the economic effects at least, of this violence. In Tacoma, the county surrounding Tacoma, this expulsion was extremely effective. There were more than 900 Chinese recorded in a territorial census before this expulsion, and then it was down to one Chinese person in the entire county afterwards. And that one Chinese person did not live in Tacoma. Tacoma was completely devoid of Chinese. These expulsions forced the Chinese from places that they knew to places that they did not know, from communities where they were known to communities where they were unknown. And so I argue that this violence basically made people from neighbors into strangers, and it did so sort of figuratively and literally. For the Chinese, sometimes this was an experience of segregation, as Chinese fled sort of the smaller towns and congregated in ethnic enclaves in hopes of security, like Chinatown in San Francisco. But it was also a history of dispersion as Chinese went outside of the US West into the Midwest and the East Coast, seeking new opportunity in perhaps safer places. And so in some ways we see both segregation and the Great Migration, if we can draw a parallel to the experience of African Americans in Jim Crow. I also, in my work, think about how this violence affected national law, and that it helped to push forward a unilateral Chinese exclusion law that then would bar a lower class, working class Chinese from entering the United States until the 1940s, and really for another decade beyond that as well. Other scholars have talked about how this helped to build US border control. I go a step farther in my work and argue that that this violence and the law helped to forge the very concept of the alien or non-citizen in American law and society. Because although Chinese were not the first non-citizens or aliens in the United States, America first drafted national answers to some of these questions that I have written out here for the purpose of excluding the Chinese. And so questions that still affect immigrants today, you know, who is considered an alien and for how long, which aliens should be allowed to enter the nation, can the government expel or exclude, what rights do non-citizens possess, can unauthorized non-citizens claim those same rights? All of these things are being worked out in the midst of anti-Chinese violence, anti-Chinese sentiment, and an attempt to exclude Chinese immigrants into the United States. And since these things are written into law and Supreme Court decisions, they continue to affect immigrants to this day. And then, so in my work, I talk about that, you know, it's not just a transformation of national law, but for individuals, for Chinese migrants, this is also a change in status. And it's for the first time, the Chinese Exclusion Act produces essentially undocumented people, people that have entered the country unauthorized by the American state. And so I think in my work about how we understand this early experience of undocumentedness. And I often go to this poem, which was written in 1911, and describes something that feels very present day, I think. You know, he said, I roam America undocumented. White men blackmail me with many demands. I say one thing and they another. I just want to complain. I want to complain of injustice, but my tongue stutters. At a loss for words, I rack my brain for a solution to no avail. Thrown into a prison cage, I cannot fly away. Don't you think this is cruel? Don't you think this is cruel? And so as I transition to the second part of my very short talk, I want to point out 3 effects of this violence that I think is particularly relevant for today. You know, first, that the violence is making neighbors into strangers. It's marginalizing the Chinese, setting them apart, and reinforcing ideas that they did not belong in the United States. Second, and relatedly, the violence erased Chinese from these communities. It pushed them out, it displaced them, and it erased the collective memories. So this non-belonging continues to have effects on how we remember the American West or remember the nation. And the third is that this violence changed immigration law and created the legal disadvantages of alienage. So between exclusion and naturalization laws, the Chinese were literally made into perpetual foreigners because they were unable to naturalize based on their race. And because of immigration law, there was a stunting of generations where Chinese immigrants had difficulty coming into the country, especially Chinese women. This meant fewer second generation, a smaller third generation. What the effect is today is it makes our Asian American community sort of artificially, generationally young and artificially smaller than it would have been if not this long history of discrimination at the federal level. And I think this is feeding into an idea that Asian American community is marginal in American society. So if we think about now a history of the present, I think, unfortunately, I'll run through this quickly because I think we all know this. What are we seeing in the present? Well, we saw the former president make racial slurs against Asian people when talking about the pandemic. We have seen a well-documented surge in anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents. And back in last March, we saw a mass shooting in Atlanta that targeted Asian massage parlors. Scholars looking at this have been quick to point out that although this appears to be a surge in hate crimes, it is not sort of an isolated surge, that if you go to Asian Americans and survey them, you'll find that many of them have experienced hate crimes and hate incidents beyond the last year. They'll report earlier incidents as well. At the same time, we're seeing a dramatic outpouring of anti-hate campaigns, community activism, and research on anti-Asian hate crimes. And in the past few months, I've been talking a fair amount to journalists, and many of them, I think, are invested in describing all of this as unprecedented, both the violence and the activism. And I really want to push against that, partially because as a historian, nothing is unprecedented, but also because I think we really need to recognize these precedents. The longer history is influencing the way that the Asian American community experiences this present wave of violence. And so I think that we need to understand this longer history to understand the level of fear and anger among Asian American community. The second thing I'd say is this longer history suggests that the problem of prejudice and of violence is not simply tied to pandemic anxieties. It's a deeper problem, and that means that it's going to need more long-term solutions. It's not going to just disappear in a post-pandemic world. And so I don't want to go on too long, so I'm going to do this quickly, but what are some of these roots of this violence? If we're thinking about a history of the present, the history I told you of expulsions in the 19th century is just one of the ways we can think about roots. I think another way we can think about roots is just these series of laws that I've already talked about before, that there are many reasons that even to this day, Asian Americans are seen as perpetual foreigners, and that is because they were made into foreigners by American laws. And so a series of racially exclusionary naturalization laws, Asian exclusion laws at the level of immigration, anti-miscegenation laws, and things like Japanese removal and incarceration during World War II. So a lot of this connects to federal policy and law. The other thing I think we need to understand is that, anti-Asian hate crimes are not new. It's just that a lot of these crimes against Asian people were not recognized as hate crimes in the past. And often, or sometimes at least, they were not even recognized as crimes. And so we can talk about, going back to the 19th century, the lynching of Chinese miners. Often some of the racialized violence I see is the cutting of queues. Other examples are sort of the violence against Japanese community after Pearl Harbor. An often cited example is the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982 by unemployed auto workers. There's also attacks. We can look at attacks against Muslims and Sikhs after 9/11. And this kind of violence is tied to many things, right? Labor competition, war, auto manufacturing, 9/11. These are all many very different phenomenons, different moments in time. But I think what unites them is a sense that Asians are distinct outsiders within American society, that they're people that do not belong. And that this is reinforced through these kinds of acts of violence. But I also think that we need to recognize the history of state violence against Asians. If we're really trying to understand anti-Asian violence, we would be doing a disservice if we only looked in sort of the domestic sphere, because state violence, some of it's domestic. There is a history of violent policing in the American West, But a lot of the state violence against Asian peoples has been through the American wars in Asia. And many things divide the wars in the Philippines, in Japan, in Korea, and in Vietnam. But one thing that does unite these wars is that they were accompanied by a lot of racial prejudice, racial slurs, and racial understandings of these enemies of the United States. And so within the violence of war, we also see racial violence. And this racial violence, even when it occurs outside the United States, informs the way that Americans view Asians and the ways in which they conceive of the value of Asian lives. I think, because I want to stay within time, I'm going to skip a little bit to the end here. I'm happy to come back and talk about anti-Asian misogyny and the history of that. I'm happy to talk about disease scapegoating, because we have that as well. But really, what I want to end with is this image. I gave a talk at Hampshire College last spring, and the student artist repurposed my book cover in this way, which I thought was such an amazing artistic sort of repurposing of a historical photograph. I thought I would just show it to you. But what it reminds me is that we need to approach and think about these larger histories rather than sort of waiting for the anti-Asian violence we're seeing today to end with the hopeful ending of the pandemic. I think that we have a much larger, longer problem that we need to think through. It's going to take more forward thinking and longer term solutions to address than just addressing sort of individual incidents or this individual moment.